Welcome back. Before we dive into this nightmare, I need you to do something. Like this video. Subscribe. Not because I'm begging, though I kinda am, but because by the time we're done, you'll understand why you should have. We're about to explore what would actually happen if you, modern you, with your antibiotics and heating, suddenly got transported back to 1325. Not as royalty, as an ordinary person trying to survive another day. And here's what you need to know: you wouldn't make it. You'd probably be dead before sunset. This is an exaggeration. By the end of this, you'll know exactly how many different ways you die, why you wouldn't last a day in medieval times, and more. Hey, welcome back. Before we start, please like and subscribe to our channel. I mean it. Hit that like button right now. Subscribe so you don't miss future videos. We're going to spend the next few hours talking about something that sounds romantic, but is absolutely horrifying. What would happen if you, a modern person, were suddenly transported to medieval times? Not as a noble, not as someone with power or resources, as an ordinary person, as someone who'd actually have to survive. And I'm not talking about fantasy adventures or time travel stories. I'm talking about the brutal, uncomfortable, genuinely horrifying reality of what medieval life was actually like. By the end of this, you're going to understand that you wouldn't last a day. You wouldn't last an hour. You'd probably be dead within minutes. Please like and subscribe to our channel. The moment you arrive in medieval times, something becomes immediately clear. Your body is a death trap. Your health collapses instantly. Let's start with the most fundamental problem. Modern medicine has kept you alive your entire life. You've had vaccines. You've had antibiotics. You've had surgery. You've had anesthesia. You've had dental care. Modern medicine has prevented you from dying from infections that would be fatal in medieval times. And the moment you arrive in the medieval world, all of that protection disappears. You don't have antibiotics. You don't have any of the immunizations that have kept you alive. You don't have vaccines. You don't have any of the things that have kept you alive. You have medieval medicine, which is basically torture and poison. Let's say you get a cut. A simple cut on your hand from handling something sharp. In 2024, you'd wash it, maybe grab a bandage, and forget about it by dinner. In medieval times, that cut would get infected. There are no antibiotics. There's no understanding of germ theory. No concept that microscopic organisms could be entering your wound. The infection would spread. Within days, you'd have an abscess. Within a week, the infection would enter your bloodstream. You'd develop blood poisoning. You'd go into septic shock. You'd die. A simple cut would kill you, and there would be nothing anyone could do about it except watch you die. But it's not just cuts. A splinter would cause infection. An insect bite would cause infection. A blister would cause infection. You'd have a toothache, and the tooth would become infected. The infection would spread to your jaw, to your brain, and you'd die. Any break in your skin would be potentially fatal. And medieval people understood this on some level. They understood that injuries got infected and people died, but they had no way to prevent it. They had no antibiotics. They just watched people die from infections. And here's what's worse. Medieval medicine would kill you faster. The doctor would bleed you, deliberately draining your blood until you fainted. Your body would be weaker. Your infection would still be there. If you developed an infection, if you went to a medieval doctor, he'd try to treat you, and the treatment would be horrifying. They might bleed you, which would weaken you and make the infection worse. They might apply poultices made of animal waste or herbs that could introduce more infection. They might try to treat you with mercury, which is toxic. The medieval doctor would be actively making your condition worse while thinking he was helping. Let's talk about food. Modern food is produced in factories with safety regulations. It's inspected. It's tested. It's relatively safe. Medieval food was none of these things. Food was dirty. Food was often spoiled. Food was contaminated with bacteria. And if you ate contaminated food, you'd get sick. You'd get dysentery. You'd get severe diarrhea. You'd be violently ill for days. In the modern world, you'd recover. In medieval times, you'd get dehydrated and die. Dysentery was a common cause of death in medieval times. A single meal of bad food could kill you, and the food wasn't just contaminated, it was actually scarce. Medieval people didn't have abundance. They had just enough food to survive, and often not enough. You'd be constantly hungry. Your body would be malnourished. You'd be weak. Your immune system would be compromised. You'd be vulnerable to every disease. And the food you did have would be terrible. You'd eat hard bread. You'd eat salted meat. You'd eat vegetables that were basically inedible. Your diet would be monotonous and nutritionally deficient. Let's talk about hygiene. Modern hygiene is something you take for granted. You shower regularly. You wash your hands. You change your clothes. You have clean water. Medieval hygiene was non-existent. People didn't bathe regularly. They didn't change their clothes often. They didn't wash their hands. The water was contaminated. People had parasites. They had lice. They had fleas. They had infections from not being clean. And the smell would be overwhelming. Medieval cities smelled horrific. The combination of unwashed bodies, human waste, animal waste, and decay would be nauseating. And you'd have to live in that. You'd have to adapt to the smell. You'd have to function with parasites living on your body. You'd have to deal with constant itching from lice and fleas. You'd have to live without being able to shower. You'd be covered in dirt and filth constantly. It would be psychologically disturbing even if it didn't kill you. Please like and subscribe to our channel. Let's talk about shelter. Modern shelter is comfortable. You have walls, a roof, heat, and electricity. Medieval shelter was terrible. Most people lived in small, dark rooms. There was no heating except for a fire. The room would be cold and damp. The roof would leak. The walls would be thin. Wind would come through the cracks. In winter, it would be freezing. You'd be constantly cold. Your fingers would go numb. Your toes would go numb. You'd be at constant risk of hypothermia. And there was no relief. You couldn't turn up the heat. There was no heat except for a fire, and fires were dangerous. Fires were the primary source of heat and light, and fires were deadly. A fire could spread and burn down your entire dwelling. People burned to death regularly in medieval times from accidental fires. And if there was no fire, there was no light. You'd be in complete darkness. Medieval people didn't have electricity. They didn't have light bulbs. They didn't have flashlights. They had candles and oil lamps, and these were expensive. Most people couldn't afford them. They lived in darkness after sunset, complete darkness. And in that darkness, there were dangers. There were rats. There were insects. There were snakes. There were dangers you couldn't see. You'd be constantly afraid of what might be in the darkness. You'd be stepping on rats. You'd be encountering insects. You'd be terrified. Let's talk about clothing. Modern clothing is designed for comfort. It's soft. It's fitted. It's appropriate for the weather. Medieval clothing was terrible. You wore the same clothes day after day. You wouldn't change them. You wouldn't wash them. They'd become filthy and full of parasites. They wouldn't fit well. They'd be uncomfortable. In winter, they wouldn't be warm enough. In summer, they'd be too hot. And you wouldn't have many options. You wear the same few pieces of clothing constantly. And your feet. Modern shoes are comfortable. They're designed to support your feet. Medieval shoes were basically leather wrapped around your foot. They didn't have support. They didn't have comfort. Your feet would hurt constantly. You develop blisters and sores. Your toenails would become infected. Your feet would be a source of constant pain. Let's talk about disease. Modern medicine has largely eliminated many diseases. You're vaccinated against diseases that used to kill millions of people. Medieval times had constant disease. There was the plague, which killed half the population of Europe in the 1300s. There was smallpox. There was typhus. There was leprosy. There was tuberculosis. Any of these could kill you, and there was no prevention and no cure. You'd catch a disease and you'd die. It would be horrible. You'd be in pain. You'd be disfigured. You'd be isolated because people were afraid you'd infect them. And then you'd die. Let's talk about pain. Modern medicine has pain relief. You have aspirin. You have ibuprofen. You have prescription painkillers. If you're in pain, you can take something to reduce it. Medieval people had none of this. If you were in pain, you just suffered. You endured it. There was no relief. And medieval life was constant pain. If you injured yourself, you'd be in pain for weeks. If you had an infection, you'd be in pain. If you had a tooth infection, you'd be in extreme pain. If you had arthritis or any chronic condition, you'd be in constant pain with no relief. Some medieval people would use opium or alcohol to manage pain, but these weren't reliable and they had their own problems. Alcohol would give you temporary relief, but then you'd have a hangover and the pain would be worse. And you'd risk becoming an alcoholic. Opium was expensive and unreliable. Most people just had to live with pain. This would be psychologically devastating. Constant pain day after day with no relief would break a person. Let's talk about dental care. Modern dentistry is advanced. You can get cavities filled. You can get teeth extracted painlessly with anesthesia. You can get dentures or implants. Medieval dentistry was basically extracting teeth without anesthesia. If you had a problem with a tooth, a barber or a dentist would pull it out. You'd be awake. You'd be screaming. There would be blood. It would be traumatic. And medieval people knew this. They were terrified of dental problems because they knew the treatment would be horrific. Most medieval people had terrible teeth. They were rotten. They were infected. They were painful. And they had no way to fix them. They'd lose their teeth one by one. By middle age, they'd have few or no teeth left. Eating would be difficult. Nutrition would be even worse because they couldn't chew properly. And dental infections could spread to the brain and kill you. Let's talk about childbirth. If you were a woman in medieval times, childbirth was terrifying. Modern childbirth is still dangerous, but you have medical care. You have sterile conditions. You have doctors and nurses. You have pain relief. You have a hospital. Medieval childbirth was none of these things. A woman would give birth at home with a midwife or with no professional help at all. The conditions weren't sterile. Infections were common, and many women died. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women in medieval times, and the pain was extreme. There was no anesthesia. There was no pain relief. You'd be in labor for hours, possibly days, in extreme pain. You'd be screaming. You'd be convinced you were going to die, and you might actually die. Hemorrhage was common. Infection was common. And even if you survived, you'd be traumatized, and you'd have to do it again. Medieval women would have multiple pregnancies. Each one would be a risk. Many women died after several pregnancies. Let's talk about sanitation. Modern sanitation is something you take for granted. You have toilets. You have sewage systems. Your waste is disposed of safely. Medieval sanitation was non-existent. People had chamber pots that they would empty into the street, or they would use outhouses that were contaminated and full of disease. Waste would accumulate in the streets. It would contaminate water supplies. Diseases spread through contaminated water. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, all spread through poor sanitation, and the smell would be overwhelming. Medieval cities smelled like human waste. It would be nauseating. You'd be gagging constantly, and you couldn't escape it. Everywhere you went, there would be waste and the smell of waste. Your clothes would smell like it. Your hair would smell like it. Your skin would smell like it. You'd be constantly nauseated. Let's talk about violence. Medieval society was violent. Violence was common. People would fight over minor things. A disagreement could turn into a fight. A fight could turn into someone getting killed. And there was no police to stop it. There was no law enforcement in most places. Violence happened, and nothing was done about it. If someone attacked you, you would have to defend yourself. If you couldn't, you would be hurt or killed. And medieval warfare was a constant threat. Wars happened regularly. If you were in the wrong place, you could be caught up in battle. Your village could be burned. You could be conscripted to fight. You could be killed. And if you weren't killed in battle, you might be captured and held for ransom. Violence was an ever-present threat. Let's talk about social hierarchy. Medieval society was rigidly hierarchical. You were born into a particular class, and you stayed in that class. If you were born a peasant, you were a peasant forever. You had no rights. You were basically property. A lord could do almost anything to you. He could take your food. He could take your children to work his lands. He could have you beaten. He could have you executed. You had no legal protection. You were subject to the whims of powerful people. And if you were born a woman, you had even fewer rights. Women were property. Women were controlled by men. You couldn't own property. You couldn't make decisions about yourself. You were basically a slave to your father, then to your husband, then to your son. You had no autonomy. You had no freedom. You were controlled completely. Let's talk about knowledge. Modern people have access to enormous amounts of information. You have libraries. You have the internet. You have books. You have education. Medieval people didn't understand neuroscience of REM sleep or the way the brain processes emotions, but they understood that dreams mattered. They understood that the messages in dreams were worth paying attention to. They created a system of taking dreams seriously, of discussing them, of analyzing them, of letting them influence decisions. And while their interpretation system was based on superstition and spiritual belief rather than psychology, the underlying principle was sound. Pay attention to your dreams. They're telling you something. Something in your mind is trying to communicate. Listen to it. We have schedules. We know what time it is. Medieval people didn't have accurate clocks. They didn't have schedules. Time was vague. You'd wake up when the sun came up. You'd work until the sun went down. You'd sleep. That was your day. And the days would blend together. You'd have no sense of time passing, no sense of progress, no sense of purpose. And darkness came early. In winter, it would be dark by mid-afternoon. You'd have long hours of darkness with nothing to do except sit in the cold and dark. There was no entertainment. There were no books to read. There was no music unless someone was playing an instrument. There were no games unless you could make your own. You'd just sit in darkness waiting for day. Let's talk about hunger. I'll go with medieval attitudes toward laughter and humor. This fits well with the dark tone, and I can make about how medieval people use laughter as a coping mechanism, but also how laughter could be dangerous socially. Let's talk about laughter. You probably think medieval people were grim and serious and constantly worried about sin and death, which, okay, they were worried about those things, but they also laughed. A lot, more than you'd expect. And the laughter was different from modern laughter. It was louder, cruder, less filtered, more dangerous. Medieval laughter could get you in serious trouble. It could ruin your reputation. It could get you punished. It could, in extreme cases, get you executed. Because laughter in the medieval world was never just an expression of humor. It was a weapon. It was a form of social control. It was a dangerous force that needed to be managed carefully. Medieval humor was brutal. It was crude. It was about bodily functions and sexual situations and the failures and embarrassments of other people. Fart jokes were everywhere. Literally everywhere. Medieval manuscripts, the margins of religious texts that were supposed to be sacred and serious, are filled with drawings of people farting, of monks in compromising situations, of animals doing things they shouldn't be doing. Humor was a way of poking fun at authority, at the church, at social hierarchy, but always in a way that was just subtle enough to avoid actual punishment. A joke that was obviously funny was safer than a joke that was obviously trying to make a political point. So medieval humor developed this language of innuendo and absurdity and exaggeration that let people say dangerous things while maintaining plausible deniability. But here's what made laughter actually dangerous. Laughter was contagious, and group laughter was considered subversive. If a crowd started laughing together, if they were all mocking the same thing or the same person, that represented a break in social order. It represented a moment where the authority of whoever or whatever was being mocked was temporarily suspended. So authorities were extremely nervous about laughter. They tried to control it. They tried to regulate when people could laugh and what they could laugh about. They understood intuitively what modern research has confirmed, that laughter is a form of bonding, that shared laughter creates solidarity, that a crowd that's laughing together is a crowd that's unified, potentially dangerous, potentially capable of turning against authority. Medieval festivals existed partly as a pressure release valve. Carnival, the period before Lent, was a time when normal social rules were suspended. People could wear masks. Innocent people were killed because of superstition, and you'd live in fear that you might be accused. You might be accused of witchcraft. You might be accused of being in league with demons. And there would be no way to defend yourself. And the church reinforced this fear. The church taught about hell and damnation. You were constantly told that you were sinful and that God would punish you. You'd live in fear of God's judgment. You'd do whatever the church told you to do because you were afraid of hell. The fear was a tool of control. Let's talk about sensory overload. Medieval life would assault your senses in ways you weren't prepared for. The smell would be overwhelming. The noise would be overwhelming. The masks let people say and do things that would normally get them in serious trouble. And because it was all part of the festival tradition, because everyone understood that this was a special time with special rules, it was tolerated. But outside of festivals, laughter had to be carefully controlled. A servant who laughed at the wrong time in front of a master could be punished. A woman who laughed too loudly or too freely could be seen as sexually available or morally loose. A man who laughed at something serious could be seen as mentally unstable or unreliable. Laughter was considered a form of emotional incontinence, a failure of self-control. A proper medieval person maintained composure. They didn't laugh inappropriately. You'd be shivering constantly. The cold would be painful. And you'd be living in a small, dark room with maybe one fire for heat. You'd huddle near the fire, but most of the room would be freezing. In summer, you'd be sweltering. You'd be wearing heavy clothes. You'd be working in the hot sun. You'd be sweating constantly. You'd be dehydrated. You'd be exhausted. There would be no relief, no air conditioning, no fans, just heat and misery. Let's talk about insecurity. Modern people have relative security. You know where you'll sleep tonight. You know you'll eat. You know you won't be attacked. Medieval people had no security. You didn't know if you'd be able to find food tomorrow. You didn't know if war would come. You didn't know if you'd be conscripted. You didn't know if you'd get sick and die. Everything was uncertain. You'd live in constant anxiety about the future. And if you were a woman, you'd have additional insecurity. You'd be vulnerable to sexual assault. You'd have no protection. If someone decided to assault you, there would be nothing you could do about it. You'd be vulnerable because you were weaker and because society didn't protect women. You'd live in fear of being assaulted. Let's talk about loss. Medieval people lost people constantly. Children died regularly. It wasn't unusual to lose half your children. Your spouse might die young. Your parents might die. You'd experience loss constantly, and you'd have no support, no therapists, no grief counseling. You'd just have to endure the pain. You'd bottle it up. You'd suppress it. You'd continue working while grieving. Let's talk about the future. Modern people have hope for the future. We believe things will get better. We believe we can improve our situation. Medieval people had no hope. You were born into poverty and you'd die in poverty. There was no social mobility. There was no way to improve your situation. You'd be poor your entire life. Your children would be poor. Your grandchildren would be poor. There was no hope for anything better. And you'd know this. You'd understand that your life was going to be suffering. You'd understand that you'd probably die young. A medieval person falling down and injuring themselves might inspire laughter not from cruelty, but from the shock of seeing something unexpected and dramatic. Medieval art is full of violent and painful scenes depicted in a way that's almost comedic. Bodies are twisted in exaggerated ways. Expressions are contorted. The scale is often off. And it's not entirely clear whether the artist was trying to be serious or whether they were finding the absurdity in the situation darkly funny. Maybe both. Maybe medieval people understood that pain and comedy were closely related, that extreme suffering becomes absurd, that sometimes laughter is the only reasonable response to something that's completely unreasonable. You were born into your role. You were stuck in it. You couldn't become something else. You couldn't pursue your interests because you had no time for interests. You worked. That was your existence. And when you died, you were replaced by someone else who did the same work. You were interchangeable. You were not important. And if you deviated from your role, you were punished. If you tried to do something outside your role, society would push back. If you were too ambitious, you'd be put in your place. If you had ideas above your station, you'd be humiliated. Medieval society was designed to keep people in their roles. Innovation was discouraged. Individuality was discouraged. Conformity was enforced. Let's talk about communication. Modern communication is instant. You can talk to someone on the other side of the world instantly. You can send messages. You can video call. Medieval communication was incredibly slow. If you wanted to send a message to someone in another village, you'd have to send a messenger. It would take days or weeks. The person might not receive it. The messenger might get lost. The message might be intercepted. And most people couldn't read or write, so they couldn't communicate through written messages. They could only communicate verbally with people they could speak to face. So your world was limited to your village and nearby villages. You wouldn't know what was happening in the world. I think I'll focus on something about medieval attitudes toward physical touch, intimacy, and personal space, or maybe medieval attitudes toward memory and forgetting, since that's a theme that runs through competitors' work. Or I could do medieval attitudes toward sexuality and marriage in a way that's humanizing and complex. Let me go with medieval attitudes toward marriage, sexuality, and women, but from a different angle than the Tudors section in the competitor's work. I'll focus on the reality of medieval marriage as a lived experience, with attention to power dynamics, sexuality, expectations, and the ways people navigated impossible situations. You might play simple games with dice or cards if you had them. You might listen to someone tell a story. That was basically it. And most of the time, you wouldn't have even that. You'd work all day and then you'd sleep. You'd have no breaks, no entertainment, no joy, just work and sleep. And this would affect your mental health. You'd be bored constantly. You would be depressed from the monotony. You'd be depressed from having nothing to look forward to. You'd be depressed because your life had no meaning and no purpose. You'd be depressed because you had no hope. Depression would be endemic in medieval society, though they wouldn't call it depression. They'd just call it sadness or melancholy. Let's talk about learning. Modern people have opportunities to learn. We have schools. We have libraries. We have the internet. We can learn almost anything. Medieval people had no opportunities to learn. If you were born a peasant, you'd stay a peasant. You wouldn't learn to read. You wouldn't learn mathematics. You wouldn't learn science. You'd learn only what you needed to do your job. And that was it. And this meant you'd be trapped by ignorance. You wouldn't understand how the world worked. You wouldn't understand why people got sick. You wouldn't understand astronomy or geography or history. Your understanding of the world would be based on superstition and religion, and you'd have no way to change that. You'd live your entire life in ignorance. Let's talk about control. Modern people feel they have some control over their lives. We can make choices. We can change careers. We can move to a different place. We can pursue our interests. Medieval people had almost no control. You did what you were told. You lived where you were told to live. You did the work you were assigned. You had no choices. You were controlled by your lord. You were controlled by the church. You were controlled by society. And this lack of control would be psychologically damaging. You'd feel helpless. You'd feel powerless. You'd feel like your life had no meaning because you weren't making any decisions about it. You'd be a passive participant in your own life. This would create a kind of learned helplessness. You'd stop trying to control your life. You'd just accept whatever happened to you. Let's talk about religion. Modern people have religious freedom. You can practice whatever religion you want, to no religion at all. Medieval people didn't have religious freedom. You were forced to be Christian. You had to practice Christianity the way the church told you to. If you deviated, you could be punished. You could be excommunicated. You could be tortured. You could be executed. And the church was incredibly powerful. The church controlled education, medicine, and moral authority. The church told you what to believe. The church told you what was moral. The church told you what would happen after you died. And you had to believe it. You had no choice. And if you questioned anything, you were a heretic. You were evil. You would go to hell. And the church used fear to control people. The church taught about hell and damnation. You were constantly told that you were sinful. You were constantly told that God was watching you. You were constantly told that if you didn't obey the church, you'd suffer eternal torment. This fear would control your entire life. You'd spend your entire life terrified of hell. You'd do whatever the church told you to do because you were afraid of the consequences. Let's talk about time perception. Modern people experience time as a linear progression. We think about the past, the present, and the future. We plan for the future. We remember the past. Medieval people probably experienced time very differently. Without clocks and schedules, time would be vague. Days would blur together. You'd lose track of days and weeks. Your sense of time would be different from ours. And because there was no change, because every day was basically the same, time would seem to pass very slowly. A year would feel like a decade. Your life would feel incredibly long, even if you only lived to 40 or 50. Every day would be the same grinding monotony. Every week would be the same. Every month would be the same. And it would go on forever. Let's talk about relationships. Modern people form relationships based on choice and affection. You choose your friends. You choose your romantic partners. You choose your community. Medieval people had very limited choice in relationships. You lived in a village, and you had relationships with the people in that village. You couldn't choose. You were stuck with whoever was there. And relationships were often strained because everyone was poor and stressed. People were competing for scarce resources. People were stressed from constant hunger and work. People were traumatized from violence and loss. Relationships would be difficult. People would fight. People would argue. And you couldn't escape. You'd be stuck living near the same people for your entire life, even if you hated them. And romantic relationships were also not about choice. If you were a woman, your parents would arrange a marriage. You'd be married to whoever they chose. You might not like him. You might not want to marry him, but you had no choice. You'd be married, and you'd have to live with him. And if he was abusive, if he was cruel, if he was violent, you had no recourse. You were stuck with him forever. Divorce was an option. Let's talk about aging. Modern people age relatively gracefully. We have health care that manages age-related problems. We have mobility aids. We have pain management. We have comfortable retirement. Medieval people aged horribly. Your body would be broken by decades of hard labor. Your back would be damaged. Your joints would hurt. Your teeth would be gone. Your vision would be failing. And there would be no relief. And you'd be expected to keep working. You wouldn't retire. You couldn't retire. You needed to work to eat. So you'd be elderly and broken and still having to work. You'd be in pain constantly. You'd be exhausted. You'd be slowly dying while still having to work. And people would have little sympathy for you because you were less productive. You'd be a burden. And if you became completely unable to work, if you became completely disabled, you'd be in serious trouble. You'd have no income. You'd have no family to support you if you had no children. You'd be on the streets begging. You'd be dependent on charity from the church or from wealthy people. You'd be living at the mercy of others. Let's talk about mortality. Modern people live relatively long lives. The average lifespan is around 80 years. Medieval people lived much shorter lives. The average lifespan was maybe 35 years. But this number is misleading because it includes infant mortality. Many children died before age 5. If you survived childhood, you had a decent chance of living to 50 or 60. But many people didn't. Many people died young. And you'd know that death was coming. You'd live with the knowledge that you might die at any time. You might die from disease. You might die from infection. You might die from starvation. You might die from violence. You might die in childbirth if you were a woman. You'd live in constant awareness of your mortality, and death would be common. You'd see people die regularly. You'd see children die. You'd see your spouse die. You'd see your friends die. You'd see elderly people die. Death would be a constant presence. You'd be used to it in a way that modern people aren't. You'd normalize it, but it would still be horrifying. Let's talk about grief. Medieval people experienced grief regularly and intensely. They'd lose children constantly. They'd lose spouses. They'd lose friends. And they'd have to keep going. They'd have to keep working. They'd have to keep living. They couldn't take time off to grieve. They had to grieve while working. They had to grieve while struggling to survive. And there was no support for grief. No therapists. No grief counseling. No support groups. You just bottle it up. You'd suppress it. You'd let it fester inside you. You become bitter and broken. Grief would accumulate over a lifetime. Loss upon loss upon loss. Let's talk about animals. Modern people have limited interaction with animals. We have pets. We might see farm animals if we visit a farm. But mostly, we don't interact with animals. Medieval people lived alongside animals constantly. Animals lived in villages. Animals lived in homes, sometimes. Animals were used for work. Animals were food. And you have to deal with the reality of animals. Animals got sick. Animals died. You'd see animals being slaughtered for food. You'd see animals suffering. And you'd have to accept it. You'd have to be part of it. You couldn't be squeamish about it. Animals were part of life and death. Let's talk about waste. Modern people don't deal with waste directly. It's collected and removed. Medieval people had to deal with waste constantly. Human waste was everywhere. Animal waste was everywhere. Food waste was everywhere. It would smell horrible. It would attract rats and insects. It would spread disease. And you just have to accept it. You'd have to live in it. Let's talk about seasons. Modern people don't experience seasons as intensely as medieval people. We have heating in winter and air conditioning in summer. We have food from all over the world year-round. Medieval people experienced seasons intensely. Winter was hard. Winter meant cold and darkness and scarcity. Summer meant work and heat and disease. And every season had challenges. And you'd have no way to escape the seasons. You couldn't go somewhere warmer in winter. You couldn't escape the heat in summer. You just have to endure whatever the season brought. And seasonal depression would be real. Winter would be particularly bad. Long darkness and cold and isolation. Many people will become depressed in winter. Let's talk about alcohol. Medieval people drank a lot of alcohol. Water wasn't safe to drink. It was contaminated. So people drank beer and wine instead. Even children drank beer. Alcohol was safer than water. But this meant everyone was drinking alcohol constantly. Everyone was slightly intoxicated. This would affect behavior and decision-making. This would create alcoholism and addiction. And alcohol would be a coping mechanism. You drink to escape the misery. You drink to forget. You drink to numb the pain. And you become dependent on it. You become an alcoholic without even trying. The system would push you toward alcoholism. And there would be no support for addiction. You'd just be an alcoholic struggling to survive. Let's talk about the passage of time in medieval life. Days would be exactly the same. You'd wake up. You'd work. You'd eat a small meal. You'd work more. You'd sleep. You'd repeat. Day after day. Week after week. Month after month. Year after year. Nothing would change. You'd live in monotonous routine. You'd slowly lose your mind from the monotony. And holidays and festivals would be the only breaks from this routine. Christmas, Easter, Saints' Days. These would be the only times when a routine would break. And people would celebrate intensely because it was the only break they got. They'd drink, they'd dance, they'd celebrate wildly. And then it would be back to the routine. Let's talk about something that's really fundamental. Your sense of privacy and personal space. Modern people have privacy. You have your own room. You have your own bathroom. You can close a door and be alone. You have psychological space. Medieval people had almost no privacy. If you were poor, you lived with your entire extended family in 1 or 2 rooms. You'd sleep together. You'd eat together. You'd have no privacy. You'd never be alone. And this would affect your mental health. Humans need solitude. Humans need private space. Medieval people didn't have it. They were constantly surrounded by other people. They had no escape from each other. If you wanted to be alone, you couldn't. You'd be constantly in close proximity to other people, constantly dealing with their issues, constantly exposed to their bodies and their bodily functions. And there would be no concept of personal hygiene privacy. People would use the bathroom in front of each other. People would bathe in front of each other if they bathed at all. Everything would be public. Everything would be exposed. There would be no modesty, no privacy, no personal space. Let's talk about anxiety and stress. Modern people experience anxiety and stress, but we have outlets. We have exercise. We have entertainment. We have therapy. We have ways to manage stress. Medieval people had almost no outlets. They'd be stressed constantly from survival needs. They'd be anxious about food, about disease, about violence, and they'd have no way to manage it. And the stress would be constant. You'd never feel safe. You'd never feel secure. You'd be in a state of low-level anxiety all the time. This would affect your health. Chronic stress would weaken your immune system. Chronic stress would damage your body. You'd age faster. You'd get sick more easily. You'd be broken by stress. Let's talk about decisions. Modern people make decisions constantly. We choose what to eat. We choose what to wear. We choose where to live. We choose our careers. We choose our hobbies. We have agency. We make choices. Medieval people made almost no choices. They lived where they were born. They did the work they were assigned. They wore what was available. They ate what was provided. They had no agency. They were passive. And this would be psychologically damaging. Humans need to make choices. Humans need agency. Without it, you become helpless. You become depressed. You become broken. Medieval people would have low self-esteem. They would feel worthless. They would have no sense of self-determination. They would be broken psychologically. Let's talk about cleanliness. Modern people are relatively clean. We shower regularly. We wash our hands. We change our clothes. Medieval people were filthy. They didn't bathe regularly. They didn't change clothes regularly. They didn't have clean water. They'd be covered in dirt and filth constantly. And this would affect your mental health. Being dirty is psychologically uncomfortable. Being filthy is degrading. You'd feel degraded. You'd feel ashamed. You'd be uncomfortable in your own skin. And you couldn't do anything about it. You couldn't shower. You couldn't clean yourself. You'd be stuck being filthy. And the parasites would be constant. Lice would be living in your hair. You'd be scratching constantly. Your scalp would be raw. Fleas would be living on your body. You'd be itching constantly. Your skin would be raw from scratching. You'd be infested with parasites, and there was nothing you could do about it. Let's talk about language and communication. Medieval people spoke languages that were different from modern languages. If you were transported back, you might not understand them. The language would have different vocabulary, different grammar, different pronunciation. You might not be able to communicate. You might be unable to understand what people were saying. If the world is temporary, if everything will be destroyed and remade, then the injustice in this world becomes less important. Yes, the rich exploit the poor. Yes, people suffer unfairly. Yes, evil people prosper and good people suffer. But this is the temporary world. The next world will be fair. God will divide the saved from the damned. God will reward the righteous and punish the wicked. So you could endure almost anything if you believe that ultimately God would make it right. You could forgive people. You could accept your suffering. You could maintain hope not in this world, but in the next one. Medieval apocalyptic belief also created community. People united around shared expectation of the end. They prepared together. And you'd have to decide whether to go to a doctor or not. If you didn't go to a doctor, you might die from untreated illness. If you did go to a doctor, the treatment might kill you. There was no winning. Illness was a death sentence either way. Let's talk about death and dying. Modern death is often quick and relatively painless. You have pain management. You have medical care. You have comfort measures. Medieval death was often slow and painful. You'd be in agony. You'd be suffering. You'd be aware of yourself dying. You'd be terrified. And people would watch you die. They'd gather around you as you died. You'd die in front of an audience. And people didn't know how to manage dying. They didn't have pain medication. They didn't have comfort measures. They had religion. The priest would come and give you last rites. You'd be told about heaven and hell. You'd be told to prepare your soul. But you wouldn't be made comfortable. You'd just suffer as you died. Let's talk about the aftermath of death. Modern death is managed. Bodies are handled by professionals. Medieval death was handled by family. You'd have to wash the body. You'd have to prepare it for burial. You'd have to dig the grave or pay someone to dig it. You'd have to participate in your loved one's death. You'd have to deal with the body directly. This would be traumatic. Let's talk about children. Medieval children were treated very differently from modern children. A father could beat his children for disobedience. A husband could beat his wife for poor housekeeping. A lord could beat a peasant for trespassing. Violence was a default punishment for minor infractions. It was quick. It was immediate. It was considered normal discipline. Nobody intervened. Nobody considered it abuse. It was just how you corrected behavior. Serious violence was just as common. Stabbing, beating, mutilation were responses to insults and disputes. A man who felt disrespected might stab his rival. A man who was cheated might break his cheater's fingers. A woman who was seduced and abandoned might be physically attacked by her family. These weren't aberrations. These were normal occurrences in medieval life. You could be respected for your knowledge, your skills, your character. Medieval people had respect based only on social class. If you were poor, you had no respect. You were beneath people of higher status. You were treated poorly. You were not considered fully human by people of higher status. And this would be psychologically damaging. You'd internalize the idea that you were inferior. You'd believe you deserved to be treated poorly. You'd have no self-worth. You'd be broken psychologically by constant disrespect and degradation. Let's talk about warfare and conscription. If medieval warfare came to your area, if armies were marching through, your life would be turned upside down. Armies would take food. Armies would take shelter. You were constantly aware of who was near you, what their mood was, whether they were likely to escalate to violence. You developed skills for reading anger, for diffusing conflict before it became physical, for protecting yourself. You learned from childhood that your safety depended on your ability to navigate social situations carefully. Medieval punishment was public and brutal. If you were convicted of a crime, the punishment wasn't done in secret. It was done in the town square. It was meant to be witnessed. It was meant to be remembered. A thief might have his hand cut off. An adulterer might be publicly whipped. A serious criminal might be executed in a way designed to be as painful and humiliating as possible. Your life will be destroyed by war. Let's talk about superstition and magic. Medieval people believed in magic. They believed that witches could curse you. They believed that demons could possess you. They believed that certain people had evil eyes that could harm you. And these weren't just beliefs. People acted on these beliefs. People would accuse others of witchcraft. People would try to harm people they believed were cursed. People would perform rituals to protect themselves from magic. And if you were accused of witchcraft, you were in serious danger. You could be tortured. You could be executed. And there would be nothing you could do to defend yourself. Your accusers would be believed. You would be guilty until proven innocent. And it would be impossible to prove your innocence. Witchcraft accusations could destroy you. Let's talk about the role of the church in daily life. The church was present in everything. The church controlled what you believed. The church controlled what you did. The church controlled when you worked. Sundays and holy days were mandatory rest days for religious observance. You had to attend services. You had to confess your sins. You had to follow church rules. And the church was oppressive. The church taught that you were sinful. The church taught that your body was evil. The church taught that pleasure was sinful. The church taught that you needed to suffer to be holy. Torture was legal. It was used to extract confessions. A person accused of a crime would be tortured until they confessed. This was considered legitimate. This was considered necessary. How else would you know if someone was guilty? How else would you get them to admit what they'd done? The idea of innocent until proven guilty didn't exist. The assumption was that if you were accused, you probably did it. Torture was the method of getting you to admit it, and the confession extracted through torture was considered valid. It didn't matter that you might be confessing to something you didn't do. You confessed. Therefore, you were guilty. Therefore, you were punished. Executions were spectacles. People came from miles around to watch. But preservation methods weren't perfect. Food would spoil. Food would rot. Grains would be infested with insects. Stored meat would develop harmful bacteria. And you couldn't tell if food was bad just by looking at it. You'd eat it and get sick. You'd eat spoiled food and develop food poisoning. You'd be violently ill. You might die. And in winter, food would run out. You'd eat the last of your stored food. You'd be hungry until spring when new crops came in. You'd be starving. You'd be weak. You'd be vulnerable to disease. Winter was when most people died. Let's talk about travel. Modern people travel easily. You can fly across the world in hours. You can drive across a country in days. Medieval travel was incredibly difficult. If you wanted to go somewhere more than a few miles away, you had to travel on foot or on horseback. It would take days or weeks to get there. And travel was dangerous. You might encounter bandits. You might encounter wild animals. You might get lost. You might encounter bad weather. You might get sick while traveling. You might break a bone and be stranded. Travel was risky. Many people died while traveling. And most medieval people didn't travel. They stayed in their village their entire life. They never went anywhere. Let's talk about writing and literacy. Modern people take literacy for granted. Almost everyone can read and write. Medieval people mostly couldn't. Maybe 1 or 2% of the population could read. A man could kill another man who had insulted his honor, and that was understood as justice, as necessary restoration of balance. Blood feuds would develop, where families would escalate violence against each other generation after generation, and this was understood as legitimate, as following codes of honor and justice. The violence might be brutal, but it was comprehensible. It was part of a system. It was following rules, even if those rules were different from what we would consider justice. What's remarkable is that despite this casual violence, despite this constant awareness of danger, medieval communities held together. They had relationships. They had friendships. They had love. They had loyalty. You could be beaten. You could be imprisoned. You could be sold into slavery. Debt was a trap. If you fell into debt, you'd never escape. You'd be in debt your entire life. Your children would inherit your debt. It was a system designed to keep people poor and controlled. Let's talk about animals and their treatment. Medieval people relied on animals for food and labor. Horses, oxen, pigs, chickens, cows. Animals were beaten. Animals were worked to exhaustion. Animals suffered. And you'd be aware of this suffering. You'd see it every day. You'd become numb to animal suffering. And animals could hurt you. A horse could kick you. An ox could gore you. Dogs could bite you. Animals were dangerous. You'd have to be careful around them. Medieval bodies were battlefields, and medieval people understood their bodies as places where illness lived constantly, sometimes dormant, sometimes active, but always present and always threatening. The medieval understanding of illness was completely different from modern understanding. They didn't understand infection. They didn't understand contagion in the way we do. They didn't understand that certain diseases were caused by bacteria or viruses. Instead, they understood illness as an imbalance of humors. The body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant these 4 humors were in balance. Illness meant they were imbalanced. A fever meant too much heat, too much blood, too much yellow bile. Let's talk about resilience and adaptation. But some people might adapt. Some people might survive. Medieval people were born into these conditions. They grew up in poverty and suffering. They knew nothing else. They didn't know that a better life was possible. They accepted their conditions. They endured. They survived. But you wouldn't have this advantage. You'd know what you were missing. You'd know that there was a better way to live. This knowledge would destroy you. Let's talk about water. Modern people have clean water. You turn on a tap, and water comes out. You drink it without thinking about it. Medieval people didn't have clean water. Water came from wells or streams. Water was often contaminated. People would drink from the same water sources where animals drank, where waste was dumped. Water was filthy, and you had to drink it. You couldn't survive without water. So you drink contaminated water constantly. You'd get dysentery. You'd get cholera. You'd get typhoid. These diseases would kill you. They'd cause severe diarrhea and vomiting. You'd become dehydrated. You'd die. And there would be no treatment, no antibiotics, no for fluids, just death. And even when water seemed clean, it might not be. You couldn't test it. You couldn't know if it was safe. You just drink it and hope you didn't get sick. And many times you would get sick. Waterborne illness was common. People died from drinking water constantly. You'd go to a physician or a barber surgeon, and they'd open a vein and let you bleed into a bowl. How much blood? Until you felt faint. Until the physician thought enough had come out. The idea was that you had excess blood that needed to be removed. The reality was that you were being weakened further. A person with an infection would be bled, losing precious blood that their body needed to fight off the infection. A person with an illness that caused dehydration would be bled, losing more fluid. Bloodletting didn't help anything. It made almost everything worse. But it was standard practice. Surgery existed, but it was terrifying. Surgery meant pain. There was no anesthesia. There was no pain relief. You were conscious for everything. The smell came from bacteria and disease. The foul smells were actually dangerous. They contained pathogens. By breathing the smell, you were exposing yourself to disease. The smell was literally killing you. Let's talk about noise. Medieval villages and towns were loud. There were animals making noise. There were people working and talking loudly. There were bells ringing from churches. There was constant noise, and you couldn't escape it. You couldn't go somewhere quiet. You couldn't close a door and have silence. Noise would be constant. And loud noise is stressful. Loud noise causes anxiety. Loud noise damages hearing over time. You'd be exposed to constant loud noise, and it would damage your mental and physical health. You'd develop hearing loss. You'd develop anxiety disorders. You'd be stressed constantly from the noise. Let's talk about darkness. We've mentioned this, but it's worth expanding on. Medieval darkness would be profound. When the sun set, there would be almost complete darkness. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. You'd have to move carefully. You'd bump into things. You'd be afraid. And darkness is psychologically disturbing. Humans are diurnal creatures. We're meant to be active during the day and sleep at night. Medieval people would be active only during daylight hours. When darkness fell, they'd mostly be in their homes trying to sleep. Long darkness would cause seasonal affective disorder. It would cause depression. It would cause psychological problems. And there would be no electric light, no light bulbs, no flashlights, maybe a candle if you could afford one. But candles were expensive. Most people couldn't afford them. They'd just live in darkness. They'd live in caves, essentially. Dark, damp, cold spaces with no light. Let's talk about exercise and physical fitness. Modern people can choose to exercise or not. We have gyms. We have equipment. Medieval people exercised constantly, but it wasn't enjoyable exercise. It was labor, hard physical labor. Your body would be worked hard constantly, but the exercise would be repetitive and damaging. You do the same motions over and over. You develop injuries. You develop carpal tunnel. You develop tendinitis. You develop back problems. You'd be damaged by the constant repetitive labor. Your body would be broken. Let's talk about clothes. Medieval clothes were uncomfortable. They were made of rough materials. They didn't fit well. They were heavy. They restricted movement. You'd wear the same clothes day after day. They'd get dirty, and you wouldn't change them. They'd become stiff and uncomfortable. And in summer, clothes would be too hot. In winter, clothes wouldn't be warm enough. You'd never be comfortable in your clothes. You'd be constantly uncomfortable. And the clothes would last forever because replacing them was expensive. You'd wear the same damaged clothes until they literally fell apart. Let's talk about sleep. Modern people sleep in comfortable beds with pillows and blankets. Medieval people slept on straw. They slept in the same clothes they worked in. The straw would be infested with insects and parasites. The bedding would smell. The sleeping area would be cold and damp, and sleep would be interrupted. You'd be uncomfortable so you wouldn't sleep deeply. You might be woken by animals. You might be woken by other people. You might have to take shifts standing watch. Your sleep would be fragmented and poor. You'd be constantly exhausted. Let's talk about hair. Medieval people didn't cut their hair regularly. They didn't wash their hair regularly. Hair would become matted and filthy. Lice would infest hair. Your head would itch constantly. Your hair would smell terrible. You want to cut it, but you couldn't because it was too difficult. And the itching from lice would be constant. You'd scratch your head constantly. Your scalp would bleed. You'd develop infections. The itching would drive you crazy. You'd be unable to concentrate on anything else because of the constant itching. Let's talk about skin conditions. Medieval people developed severe skin conditions. Eczema from poor hygiene, psoriasis from stress, boils and abscesses from infections, ringworm from fungal infections, scabies from parasitic mites. Your skin would be covered in sores and infections, and the treatments for these conditions were terrible. You'd be treated with leeches. You'd be treated with poultices made of harmful substances. The treatment would make the condition worse. You'd be stuck with painful skin conditions that wouldn't heal. Let's talk about mental health. We've touched on this, but it deserves more attention. Medieval people would have high rates of depression and anxiety. They'd live in constant fear. They'd live in constant pain. They'd live in constant hunger. They'd live in constant stress. Their mental health would be destroyed. Some people would develop severe mental illness. Some would become catatonic. Some would become psychotic. Some would become suicidal. Mental illness wouldn't be understood or treated. People would be seen as possessed or cursed. They'd be isolated. They'd be feared. They might be killed. Let's talk about the complete lack of future orientation. Modern people think about the future. We plan. We save. We invest. We think about what we'll do in 5 years or 10 years. Medieval people couldn't think like that. The future was uncertain. Tomorrow might never come. You might die tomorrow. Planning for the future was pointless. And this would create a kind of fatalism. You'd accept whatever happened. You wouldn't try to improve your situation because improvement seemed impossible. You'd be passive. You'd be resigned. You'd have given up hope before you even tried. Let's talk about something we haven't fully explored: reproduction and sexuality. Medieval people had sex. Medieval people had children. But sex in the medieval world was very different from modern sex. Sex was tied to reproduction. It was tied to duty. It was tied to religion and morality. Sex for pleasure was considered sinful, and women had almost no control over reproduction. A woman would get married, and then she'd start having children. She'd have children year after year. She'd be pregnant almost constantly. She'd be nursing babies constantly. Her body would be destroyed by repeated pregnancies. Her health would be compromised. She'd age rapidly, and miscarriages were common. Women would miscarry from hard labor or stress or poor nutrition. They'd lose babies constantly, and they'd have to keep going. They'd have to keep trying to have more children. They'd be trapped in a cycle of pregnancy, miscarriage, and childbirth. And childcare would be incredibly difficult. You'd have multiple children, and you'd have to care for them while also working. You'd have no childcare, no babysitters, no help. You'd be responsible for your children constantly. You'd be exhausted. Your children might die. You'd have to keep going. Let's talk about aging parents and elder care. Modern people often put elderly parents in nursing homes. Medieval people had to care for elderly parents at home. Elderly people would live with their children. They require care. They'd need help with basic tasks. And you'd be responsible for them. You'd have to feed them. You'd have to clean them. You'd have to care for them while also working and caring for your own children. And elderly people would be a burden. They'd consume resources. They'd take up space. They wouldn't be able to work. They'd be taking more than they were giving. And there would be no social safety net, no social security, no pensions, just your family taking care of you until you died. Let's talk about disabilities. Medieval people had disabilities: blindness, deafness, lameness, cognitive disabilities. And there were no accommodations for disabilities. There was no wheelchair access. There was no sign language. There was no special education. Disabled people were just left to fend for themselves. And disabled people were often seen as cursed or evil. They were isolated. They were feared. They might be killed. A blind person would be useless for work. A deaf person would be unable to communicate. A lame person would be unable to move around. Disabled people would be marginalized and abandoned. Let's talk about the concept of personal property. Modern people own things. We own our clothes. We own our possessions. Medieval peasants didn't really own things. Things were provided by the Lord. If you had something, it could be taken away. Your possessions weren't secure. They weren't yours to keep forever. And this would affect your sense of security. You couldn't build up possessions. You couldn't save things. You had to do it in a way that respected the animal's spirit, that honored the transfer that was happening. Horses had particular significance because they were crucial to medieval life. A knight's horse was a partner, an extension of the knight's self. Mistreating a horse was considered deeply wrong, not just practically but spiritually. A horse that refused to move might be sensing danger that the rider couldn't perceive. A horse that bolted might be fleeing something supernatural. A horse's reaction was taken seriously. A warrior paid attention to his horse because the horse knew things a warrior didn't. There was also deep superstition around creatures that were considered monstrous or liminal, and each injury was a potential death sentence because of infection risk. A bad injury could lead to amputation. Amputation could lead to death. Accidents were terrifying. Let's talk about the role of luck and fate. Medieval people believed in luck and fate. They believed that some people were lucky and some were unlucky. They believed that fate was predetermined. They believed that you couldn't change your circumstances. This belief would be psychologically destructive. If something bad happened, you'd attribute it to bad luck or fate. You wouldn't try to fix it because you believe you couldn't. You'd accept suffering as inevitable. You'd become passive. You'd give up. You'd stop trying to improve your situation because you believe your fate was predetermined. Let's talk about education of children. We've touched on this, but it's worth expanding on. Medieval children didn't go to school. They learned by doing. They learned their parents' trade. They learned to work. They learned to survive. They didn't learn to read or write unless they were destined for church. And children would be put to work very young. By age 5 or 6, a child would be doing chores. By age 10, a child would be doing real work. Childhood as a protected period didn't really exist. Children were just small adults. They were expected to contribute. They were expected to work. Let's talk about the role of hope. Modern people have hope. We believe things can get better. We believe we can improve our lives. We believe in progress. Medieval people had very little hope. They believed things would stay the same. They believed their children would be just as poor as they were. They believed that improvement was impossible. This lack of hope would be psychologically crushing. You'd have nothing to look forward to. You'd have no reason to keep going. You'd be stuck in a cycle of poverty and suffering with no hope of escape. You'd be broken by hopelessness. Let's talk about entertainment and relaxation. We've touched on this, but medieval people really had no entertainment. There were no movies or television. There were no video games. There were no books that most people could read. There was no music unless you had musicians nearby. There were no sports. There were no hobbies. You'd work all day and then you'd sit in darkness or near a fire. You'd talk to other people. You'd tell stories. You'd play simple games. That was it. For entertainment, you might drink alcohol. You might gamble. You might fight. You might have sex. But there was no real entertainment. No escape. No way to relax and enjoy yourself. Let's talk about the role of religion as the only source of meaning. Medieval people lived in a religious society. Religion was the only source of meaning. Your life had meaning because God had given you a role to fulfill. They didn't have any easy way to create fire. Creating fire required effort. It required materials. It required knowledge and skill. You would use flint and steel to create sparks, trying to get those sparks to catch on tinder. Try to nurse that tinder into a flame. It could take a very long time. It was frustrating. It was difficult. So instead of creating fire every time you needed it, medieval households maintained fire constantly. A fire was kept burning in the hearth, day and night. Winter and summer. That fire was never allowed to go out because relighting it was such a hassle. Someone in the household was responsible for the fire, usually a woman. Medieval society was deeply concerned with honor and shame. If you did something shameful, you'd be shamed publicly. You'd be humiliated. Your family would be shamed. You'd be socially ostracized. This shame would destroy you socially. And minor things could bring shame. Being poor was shameful. Being unmarried as a woman was shameful. Being unsuccessful as a man was shameful. Sexual misconduct brought shame. Cowardice brought shame. You'd be constantly worried about shaming yourself or your family. You'd be constantly anxious about your reputation. Please like and subscribe our channel. Let's talk about warfare more directly. If you lived during a time of war, if armies marched through your area, your life would be destroyed. Different foods required different heat levels. Different dishes took different amounts of time. A medieval cook had to understand fire intimately. She had to know how to read flames, how to interpret heat, how to adjust conditions in real time to achieve the results she wanted. But fire was also dangerous. It could escape. It could burn down your house. Medieval houses were mostly made of wood. A fire that got out of control could burn down not just your house, but your entire neighborhood. This is why fire regulations were so strict. You couldn't leave a fire unattended. You couldn't have fires in certain parts of your house. You had to have water nearby in case of emergency. You had to have someone watching the fire at night. If a fire got out of control and spread to neighboring houses, you could be held legally and financially responsible. You could be punished. You could lose everything. There were entire professions dedicated to fire management. Smiths worked with fire constantly, using it to heat metal. They understood fire at a level most people didn't. They could read color of heated metal by the color of the flames. They could tell temperature by watching fire. They were magicians with fire. They were also constantly at risk of serious burns. A smith's hands were usually scarred. His body bore the marks of constant exposure to heat and flame. Blacksmiths were considered dangerous because of their relationship with fire. If you were a peasant accused of theft, you'd be punished severely. If you were a noble accused of the same crime, you might face no punishment. Justice was not blind. Justice served the powerful. Let's talk about the specific experience of being a woman. Medieval women had almost no rights. Women were property. Women were controlled by men. A woman's father controlled her until she married. Then her husband controlled her. Then her son controlled her if she was widowed. Women had no autonomy. Women had no freedom. And women were expected to be subservient. Women were expected to obey. Women were expected to be submissive. If a woman was disobedient, she could be beaten. Domestic violence was legal. A husband could beat his wife with impunity. There was no law against it. There was no protection for women. And women were blamed for almost everything. A woman was blamed if her marriage didn't produce children. A woman was blamed if her husband was unfaithful. A woman was blamed if she was raped. Women were responsible for everything that went wrong. Women carried the blame for the world's problems. And women who were widowed or unmarried were especially vulnerable. An unmarried woman was seen as available. She'd be prey for sexual assault. She had no protection. She had no family to protect her. She was vulnerable. Let's talk about witchcraft accusations specifically. They were made from tallow, which came from animal fat, or from beeswax, which was even more expensive. Only wealthy people could afford to light candles regularly. For most people, when darkness fell, you went to bed. You worked as long as the daylight lasted, and when it was gone, your day was over. You slept. You had no artificial light. This meant that the rhythm of medieval life was determined by the sun. You woke when it rose. You worked during daylight. You rested when it was dark. This was your schedule. There was no working late into the night. There was no reading by lamplight. There was no evening entertainment that required light. Winter was particularly difficult because winter darkness came early. In the deepest part of winter, daylight might last only 6 hours. 6 hours to do all your work, and then darkness for 18 hours. You couldn't do much in that darkness. You couldn't work productively. You couldn't travel safely. You couldn't hunt. You couldn't accomplish much of anything. This created seasonal rhythms in medieval life. Summer was a time of intense work and activity because you had light. You worked from dawn to dusk. You accomplished as much as possible. You stored food, you built, you hunted, you worked on projects. Winter was a time of reduced activity. You maintained your home. You worked on indoor crafts. You told stories. You spent time in relative leisure because you couldn't accomplish much outside. You'd watch them die in agony. And then you'd get sick. You'd feel the sickness coming. You'd know you were going to die. You'd be terrified. And during the plague, society would break down. People would flee cities. Families would abandon sick relatives. Priests would refuse to administer last rites. Society would collapse. You'd be alone with your sickness. You'd die alone. Nobody would be there to comfort you. Let's talk about pollution and environmental degradation. Medieval environments were polluted. Air was polluted from fires and animal waste. Water was polluted from human waste and animal waste. Soil was degraded from overuse. The environment was toxic, and people had no understanding of pollution. They didn't know that air pollution was harmful. They didn't know that water pollution was harmful. They just knew that the air was foul and the water made them sick. They attributed it to miasma or bad air. They didn't understand the actual cause. And there was no regulation. There was no environmental protection. Factories polluted freely. People dumped waste freely. There was no concern for the environment or for public health. Pollution was a fact of life. Let's talk about the specific sensory experience of being in a medieval place. The smell would hit you first. The overwhelming smell of waste and decay. The smell would be nauseating. You'd want to vomit. Then the noise. The constant noise of people and animals. People yelling. The bride and groom were often not consulted extensively about whether they wanted this marriage. They were informed that they were going to marry this person, and they were expected to comply. The negotiations could take months. The father of the bride and the father of the groom would discuss the bride's dowry, what property and money the bride would bring to the marriage. The dowry was crucial. It was compensation to the groom's family for taking on the responsibility of supporting and controlling a woman. A large dowry could secure a better match for a daughter. A small dowry meant you had to marry your daughter to someone less desirable. A woman with no dowry might not be able to marry at all. She might become a nun because that was the only socially acceptable alternative to marriage. The groom's family would also bring property into the marriage, usually land or money or the promise of inheritance. This would become the joint property of the married couple, though it would be controlled by the husband. A wife didn't control property. Anything she brought became her husband's. Anything she earned became her husband's. She had no legal identity separate from her husband. She was a dependent, like a child, like a servant. She owed obedience to her husband. He could legally hit her. He could legally confine her. He could legally force her to have sex with him. We're not equipped to handle this level of suffering. We'd break. Let's talk about something that's really important. The concept of time and how it would feel differently. Modern people experience time as linear and measurable. We have clocks. We have schedules. We know exactly how much time has passed. Medieval people didn't have this. They experienced time very differently. Days would be marked by the sun. Work would start at sunrise and end at sunset. That was your day. But without clocks, you have no sense of how much time had passed. Hours would blur together. You'd lose track of time. Days would feel incredibly long. And because there was no variation in your routine, time would feel like it was standing still. Every day would be the same. You'd wake up. You'd work. You'd eat. You'd sleep. The next day would be identical. Weeks would blur together. Months would blend. Years would feel like decades. And this would affect your mental state. Humans need change. Humans need variation. Without it, you'd go insane. You'd experience psychological degradation. Your mind would start to break down from the monotony. You'd become depressed. You'd become desperate for any kind of change or variety. Let's talk about the role of superstition in decision-making. Medieval people made decisions based on superstition. They wouldn't travel on certain days because they believed those days were unlucky. They wouldn't start important projects on certain days. Even finding someone committing adultery wasn't grounds for divorce. It might be grounds for separation, where you could live apart, but you were still married. You couldn't marry anyone else. You were bound to someone for life. This created situations of extraordinary unhappiness. A woman might be married to a man she despised. A man might be married to a woman he didn't want. They might have been incompatible. They might have hated each other. They might have been abusive to each other. But they were still married. They were still bound. They still had to live together or live apart in a state of limbo. A wife who was beaten by her husband had no legal recourse except separation. And even if she was separated, she was still married. She couldn't remarry. She was stuck. For men, adultery was a different situation. Men could have mistresses. Men could have illegitimate children. This was considered wrong, but it was tolerated. A man of means might have a wife at home and a mistress elsewhere. His wife had to accept this or live with constant humiliation. A woman who committed adultery, by contrast, was committing a serious crime. She was betraying her husband. She was putting the paternity of heirs in doubt. She could be killed by her husband legally. The consequences for a woman's adultery were severe. The consequences for a man's adultery were minimal. Pregnancy was dangerous for women. You'd never be able to express yourself freely. You'd be constantly pretending to be someone you weren't. You'd be living a lie. This would destroy your sense of self. Let's talk about the role of alcohol as self-medication. We've touched on this, but it's worth expanding on. Medieval people drank a lot because alcohol was safer than water. But alcohol was also used for self-medication. People drank to escape the misery. People drank to forget. People drank to numb the pain. And alcoholism would be rampant. People would be constantly drinking. They'd be slightly intoxicated most of the time. This would affect behavior. This would affect judgment. This would affect relationships. But nobody would consider a problem. It would be normal. Sex was for procreation. A husband's responsibility was to impregnate his wife so she could bear heirs. How the wife experienced this was irrelevant. A woman was expected to endure sex, to submit to it, not to enjoy it. The idea that a woman might want sex, that she might have desires, that she might seek pleasure was seen as immoral. A virtuous woman didn't want sex. She endured it as a duty. A woman who seemed to want sex was sexually suspect. She was potentially unfaithful. She was potentially a temptress or a seductress. Some medieval marriages were happy. Some husbands loved their wives. Some women loved their husbands. Some couples found companionship and affection with each other. You'd respond to conflict with violence yourself, and the violence would create trauma. Even if you weren't directly harmed, witnessing violence would traumatize you. You'd see people getting hurt. You'd see people fighting. You'd see the consequences of violence. And this would damage you psychologically. Let's talk about the role of faith as the only source of comfort. Medieval people clung to faith. Faith was the only thing that made sense of suffering. If your child died, faith told you they were in heaven. If you were suffering, faith told you it had meaning. If your life was terrible, faith told you that you'd be rewarded in the afterlife. And this faith would be the only thing keeping you sane. Without faith, life would be completely meaningless. You'd be working and suffering with no purpose. But faith would give you purpose. Faith would give you hope. Faith would give you meaning. But this faith would also be manipulative. The church would use faith to control you. The church would tell you to accept your suffering. The church would tell you not to question your conditions. The church would tell you to be obedient and submissive. Faith would be a tool of control. Let's talk about the role of community and belonging. Medieval life would be organized around community. You'd live in a village. You'd know everyone. You'd have a sense of belonging. This would be the only positive aspect of medieval life. But this community would also be oppressive. Everyone would know your business. Everyone would judge you. Everyone would enforce conformity. You'd have no privacy. You'd have no individuality. You'd be part of the community, but you'd also be controlled by it. And community ties would create obligation. You'd have obligations to your family. You'd have obligations to your village. You'd have obligations to the Lord. You'd have obligations to the church. You'd be constantly obligated. You'd have no freedom. Let's talk about the role of acceptance. Medieval people would develop acceptance. They'd accept their conditions. They'd accept their suffering. They'd accept that their life would be terrible. This acceptance would allow them to survive. They wouldn't fight against their conditions. They'd just accept them. And this acceptance would be the key to survival. A modern person trying to fight against medieval conditions would break. You'd be constantly frustrated. You'd be constantly angry. You'd be constantly disappointed. You'd destroy yourself emotionally. But if you could accept the conditions, if you could stop fighting, if you could just endure, you'd have a better chance of survival. But achieving this acceptance would be incredibly difficult for a modern person. We're taught to believe things can improve. We're taught to believe we can control our lives. We're taught to believe that hard work leads to success. Medieval conditions would contradict everything we believe. We'd struggle to accept them. We'd probably fail. Let's talk about the final reality. After all of this, after understanding all the suffering and the hardship and the trauma and the pain, the fundamental reality is that you would not survive. A modern person transported to medieval times would not survive long. You'd be dead within months probably. You'd be killed by disease or starvation or violence or psychological breakdown. Your modern immune system would fail you. Your modern habits would work against you. Your modern expectations would crush you. You would not last long. You'd be another statistic in medieval mortality rates. You'd be forgotten. Your life would be just as short and meaningless as the lives of medieval peasants around you. And that's the truth about medieval times. It was brutal. It was short. It was terrible. And we should be grateful we don't live there anymore. Let's talk about what we can learn from this. Understanding what medieval life was actually like changes how we think about progress. We often romanticize the past. We think about the good old days. We think about simpler times. We imagine that medieval life was somehow better in some ways. But it wasn't. It was genuinely terrible. Medieval life was brutal. Medieval life was short. Medieval life was full of suffering. And we should appreciate how far we've come. We should appreciate modern medicine. We should appreciate clean water. We should appreciate indoor plumbing. We should appreciate electricity. We should appreciate refrigeration. We should appreciate the ability to get food year-round. We should appreciate all the things that make modern life bearable. Because without these things, life is hell. Life is misery. Life is constant suffering. And we've moved past that. We've created systems that protect us from the worst aspects of medieval life. We have antibiotics. We have vaccines. We have hospitals. We have sewage systems. We have electricity. We have running water. We have food storage technology. We have all sorts of things that medieval people would consider miraculous. But we often take these things for granted. We complain about modern life. We complain about stress in work and relationships. We complain about inequality and injustice. But we don't appreciate what we have. We don't appreciate the fact that we're not dying from infections. We don't appreciate the fact that we have access to food. We don't appreciate the fact that we have comfort and safety. Let's talk about how you would actually cope if you were transported to medieval times. First, you'd be in shock. The sensory overload would be overwhelming. The smell would be nauseating. The noise would be disorienting. The darkness would be terrifying. You'd be overwhelmed. You'd probably want to curl up and cry. Then you'd try to find shelter. You'd try to find safety. You'd probably try to find someone who could help you. You'd try to communicate, but you might have trouble with the language. You might not understand what people were saying. You'd be confused and disoriented. Then hunger would set in. You'd be hungry within hours. You'd want food. Medieval food would be disgusting to you. You'd have trouble eating it, but you'd eventually get desperate enough to eat it. You'd eat hard bread. You'd eat salted meat. You'd eat whatever was available, and you'd get sick from it. Your stomach would revolt. You'd have diarrhea. You'd be violently ill. Then disease would probably set in. You'd get an infection. You'd get dysentery. You'd get fever. You'd feel terrible. You'd want modern medicine. You'd want antibiotics. You'd want a hospital. But there would be nothing. You'd just suffer. You'd probably die from the infection. But let's say you somehow survived the first few weeks. Let's say you adapted somehow. What would your life look like? You'd be a stranger in a strange land. You'd be different. You'd speak differently. You'd act differently. You'd be marked as foreign. You'd be treated with suspicion. You might be accused of witchcraft. You might be attacked. Or you might find someone who would take you in. You might find a village that would accept you. You might find work. You might become a laborer. You'd work in the fields. You'd work from sunrise to sunset. You'd be exhausted constantly. You'd be in pain constantly. You'd be hungry constantly. You'd be cold or hot, depending on the season. You'd be uncomfortable constantly. And this would be your life. Day after day, week after week, month after month, the same grinding monotony, the same suffering, the same exhaustion. You'd have no hope of escape. You'd be trapped in this life forever. Eventually, you'd probably break psychologically. You'd either accept it or you'd want to die. Let's talk about what changed between medieval times and now. The biggest change was medicine. Modern medicine is the biggest advantage we have over medieval people. Antibiotics changed everything. Vaccines changed everything. Surgery changed everything. Understanding germ theory changed everything. We understand disease now. We can treat disease. We can prevent disease. Medieval people had none of this. The second biggest change was sanitation. Modern sanitation is incredible. We have sewage systems. We have clean water. We have toilets. We have facilities for disposing of waste. Medieval people had none of this. Waste was everywhere. Water was contaminated. Disease spread freely. The third biggest change was food production and storage. Modern agriculture produces enormous amounts of food. Modern food storage technology allows food to be preserved and transported. Medieval people were constantly hungry. Modern people have abundance. We can eat whatever we want year-round. The fourth biggest change was energy. Modern people have electricity. Medieval people had fire. Electricity powers everything. It powers lights. It powers heating and cooling. It powers refrigeration. It powers communication. It powers transportation. Medieval people had none of this. They had fire and that was it. The fifth biggest change was technology and knowledge. Modern people have access to knowledge. We have books. We have the internet. We have education. We understand how the world works. We understand science. Medieval people had almost no access to knowledge. They believed in superstitions. They didn't understand science. They didn't understand how the world worked. The sixth biggest change was legal systems and human rights. Modern legal systems protect people. Medieval legal systems were brutal. Modern people have rights. Medieval people had almost no rights. Modern people have protection. Medieval people had no protection. Let's talk about the parts of medieval life that weren't terrible. There were some good things. Community was important. People had a sense of belonging. People had connection to others. People had shared values and beliefs. This sense of community provided support and meaning. Modern people often lack this. We're isolated. We're individualistic. We don't have strong community ties. Medieval people had this. Even if the community was also oppressive, there was also a certain simplicity to medieval life that was appealing in some ways. Life was organized around basic needs. You worked. You ate. You slept. There was no complexity. There was no competition for status based on consumption. There was no advertising trying to make you feel inadequate. There was no social media creating anxiety. Life was simple, even if it was terrible, and there was a sense of meaning. Medieval people had faith. They had religion. They had beliefs about why they were suffering. This gave meaning to their lives. Modern people often lack this. We struggle with meaning. We struggle with purpose. Medieval people had this, even if it was based on superstition. But these good things don't outweigh the bad things. The suffering was too great. The pain was too constant. The hunger was too real. The disease was too deadly. The violence was too common. The lack of freedom was too oppressive. No amount of community or simplicity or meaning can outweigh the constant suffering of medieval life. Let's talk about why we romanticize the past. Humans have a tendency to look back and think things were better. We think about the good old days. We ignore the suffering. We focus on the positive aspects. We create a mythology about the past that's more appealing than the reality. And this is natural. The present is difficult. The future is uncertain. The past, even if it was terrible, is at least finished. It's done. We can think about it without the anxiety of the present. So we romanticize it. We create myths about it. We imagine it was better than it actually was. But we need to resist this. We need to understand what the past was actually like. We need to understand the suffering. We need to understand the horror. Because if we don't, we might actually try to recreate the past. We might actually try to go backwards. And that would be a disaster. Let's talk about specific aspects of medieval daily life that we haven't fully explored yet. Let's talk about what you would eat. Medieval food was terrible. If you were a peasant, you'd eat bread. You'd eat a lot of bread. Bread was a staple of the medieval diet. You'd get maybe a pound or two of bread per day. You'd eat it with water or weak beer. That was a meal. Sometimes you'd have vegetables, peas, beans, turnips, root vegetables. These would be boiled or added to soup. They'd have little nutritional value because they'd be overcooked. Sometimes you'd have meat, maybe once a week if you were lucky. It would be salted meat. It would be tough and difficult to chew. It would taste terrible. And you'd be constantly hungry even while eating. The portion would never be enough. You'd finish eating and still feel empty. Your stomach would still be growling. You'd be thinking about the next meal. You'd be looking forward to it. And the next meal would probably be the same as the last one. Bread and water. Bread and weak beer. Maybe some peas. That was it. And the food would taste terrible. Modern food is designed to taste good. Medieval food was designed to be filling and to last. Taste didn't matter. Nutrition didn't matter much. Just calories. Just enough to keep working. The food would be bland. It would be monotonous. You'd be sick of it, but you'd eat it anyway because you had no choice. Let's talk about what you would wear. Your clothes would be uncomfortable. They'd be made of rough materials. Linen or wool. They'd be scratchy. They'd irritate your skin. They'd be heavy. In summer, they'd be too hot. In winter, they wouldn't be warm enough. You'd be uncomfortable in your clothes constantly. And you'd wear the same clothes day after day. You wouldn't have many clothes. You'd have maybe one or two sets of clothes. You'd wear them constantly. They'd get dirty. You wouldn't change them. They'd smell. They'd be infested with parasites. A person whose hands showed calluses, whose nails were broken and dirty, whose hands were scarred, was clearly someone who worked with their hands. A person whose hands were soft and smooth and clean, whose nails were intact and cared for, was clearly someone who didn't do physical labor. A noble woman took pride in having soft hands because soft hands announced that she didn't have to work. A noble man took pride in having hands that showed he could handle weapons and horses, even if he had servants who did most of his physical labor. But status wasn't just about appearance. It was about behavior, too. A person of status could demand things. A person without status had to ask. A person of status could speak loudly and confidently. There would be festivals and holidays where you'd get a break from work. You'd celebrate. You'd drink. You'd dance. But these would be rare, maybe a few times a year. The rest of the time, there would be no entertainment, and you'd be bored constantly. You'd be doing repetitive work all day. Your mind would be numbed by the monotony. You'd want stimulation. You'd want something interesting to happen. But nothing interesting would happen. Every day would be the same as the last. You'd be bored and depressed and trapped. Let's talk about what you would do at night. When darkness fell, you'd be in your home. It would be dark unless you had a candle or a fire. Most likely you wouldn't have a candle because candles were expensive. This created a world of perfect clarity in some ways. You always knew where you stood relative to others. You always knew what behavior was appropriate based on your status. But it also created a world of rigid hierarchy where your position was constantly visible, constantly displayed, and constantly reinforced. What's interesting from a modern perspective is how much effort went into maintaining status through appearance. A wealthy woman might wear uncomfortable clothing, because the clothing announced her status. She might wear heavy jewelry that limited her movement because the jewelry announced her status. She might stay pale even though sun-kissed skin might have felt healthier. She might avoid any activity that might make her hands rough or calloused. She was constantly constraining herself in service of status display. Medieval people understood that appearance was power, that status was currency, and that displaying status required constant effort and sacrifice. Medieval people lived in a completely different relationship with time than we do. Modern people experience time as linear, measurable, quantifiable. We have clocks. We have seconds and minutes and hours. We schedule our lives in blocks of time. We understand that an hour is an hour no matter what we're doing or where we are. Medieval people didn't have that. They didn't have clocks. They didn't have a standardized way of measuring time. They'd try to comfort you, but there would be nothing they could do. You'd die. Let's talk about what would happen to your body over time. Your body would be damaged by work. Your back would hurt. Your knees would hurt. Your hands would be calloused and scarred. Your feet would be scarred and damaged. Your skin would be weathered. You'd look old. You'd have premature aging from sun exposure and hard work. Your teeth would be terrible. They'd be rotten. They'd hurt. You'd have infections. You'd lose teeth one by one. By middle age, you'd have few or no teeth. Eating would be difficult. Your nutrition would suffer even more. Your hair would be gray. You'd have wrinkles. You'd be stooped from years of bending over while working. The bells would ring to mark these times, and if you heard the bell, you knew which hour it was. But outside of cities with churches that rang bells regularly, most people had very little idea of precise time. They knew it was morning or afternoon or evening. They knew it was spring or summer or autumn or winter. But specific times, specific hours, these were luxuries of the clergy and the wealthy. Most people's lives were organized around tasks, not around specific times. You worked until the work was done. You slept when it was dark. You ate when you were hungry or when it was time to eat based on community practice. You didn't punch a clock. You didn't have scheduled breaks. You just worked until the work was finished or until darkness made work impossible. This had profound implications. It meant that different places experienced time differently. A village 50 miles away didn't have the same time as your village. Their church bells rang at different times. Their sunrise was slightly different. Their schedule was slightly different. The concept of universal time, of everyone in a region experiencing the same time simultaneously, didn't exist. This was fine, because people didn't travel much and didn't need to coordinate with distant places. But it meant that time was fundamentally local and particular. It also meant that the concept of punctuality didn't exist. You couldn't be late to something because there was no agreed-upon time. You showed up when you showed up. If everyone else was there, you started. If people were still arriving, you waited. There was no precision. There was no expectation of arriving at a specific time. A meeting might be scheduled for after Mass or when the sun is high, but these were approximations. People understood that things happened in sequence, that some things came before other things, but not that things happened at specific times. Medieval time was also deeply religious. Time wasn't just measurement. Time was sacred. Certain days were holy days. Certain hours were prayer times. Certain seasons were penitential. Time was organized around the church calendar. You were property of the Lord. And even if you somehow escaped, if you got away, what would you do? You'd be in a strange place. You wouldn't know anyone. You'd have no resources. You'd have no skills that were useful in a new place. You'd probably end up just as poor in the new place as you were in the old place. You'd have escaped nothing. So escape wasn't really an option. You were trapped. You were stuck in your circumstances. You couldn't leave. You couldn't change your situation. You were trapped in poverty and suffering forever. Let's talk about what would happen if you had any success. Let's say you were good at farming. Let's say you produced more than other farmers. You'd get more food. You'd be better fed than your neighbors. Time was a repetition of sacred patterns. But there was also an understanding that time was running out. The apocalypse was coming. The end times were approaching. This created a particular anxiety about time. On one level, Time was cyclical and eternal. On another level, time was finite and ending. These two understandings existed simultaneously, without being reconciled. Medieval people believed in cyclical time and linear time at the same time. They believed in eternity and in the ending of all things. The concept of a deadline didn't exist, but the concept of when God decides definitely did. Your harvest would be ready when it was ready. Your child would be born when God decided. Your life would end when God decided. If you had a spouse, you'd spend most of your time working. You'd see each other in the morning before work. You'd see each other at night, but you'd be exhausted. You'd be in pain. You'd be stressed. Your relationship would probably be strained. And if your spouse died, you'd have to grieve while continuing to work. You'd have to survive. You'd have to keep going. You wouldn't have time to process your grief. You'd bottle it up. Your grief would accumulate. And if you had children, you'd love them, but you'd also resent them. They'd be another mouth to feed. They'd require care. They'd require resources. You'd be stressed about whether you could feed them. If they got sick, you'd be stressed about whether they'd survive. Parenting would be stressful and difficult. Let's talk about what would happen as you aged. As you got older, you'd be less able to work. Your body would give out. You wouldn't be able to do as much labor. Your income would decrease. You'd be struggling even more to survive. You'd be in constant pain. You'd be increasingly dependent on others. You'd be a burden to your family. And there would be no retirement. You'd work until you couldn't work anymore. Then you'd be dependent on your children or on charity. You'd be poor and old and broken. You'd be waiting to die. Let's talk about the role of storytelling in medieval life. Stories were important. They were the entertainment. They were the way knowledge was passed down. Stories would be told around fires. Stories would be told while working. Stories would be told to children. And the stories would reflect medieval concerns. Stories about saints. Stories about heroes. Stories about the supernatural. Stories about punishment for wrongdoing. Stories about divine intervention. These stories would shape how people understood the world. They would be the framework for interpreting reality. But as a modern person, these stories would probably seem strange to you. They would be based on superstition. They would be fantastical. You would struggle to understand why people believe them. You would struggle to understand why these stories seem meaningful to people. But to medieval people, these stories would be the truth. They would be the way they understood reality. Let's talk about what would happen if you found out about modern life. If you could somehow see the future, if you could see how people live in the modern world, how would you react? You'd see people living in comfort. You'd see people with medical care. You'd see people with food whenever they wanted. You'd see people with electricity and running water. You'd see people with education and knowledge. You'd see people with freedom and choices. And you'd probably be devastated. You'd understand what you were missing. You'd understand that a better life was possible. You'd be tortured by this knowledge. You want to escape. The sea was literally depicted in medieval maps as the edge of reality. Monstrosity lurked in the sea. Creatures that defied understanding inhabited the depths. The sea was wild and untamable and represented everything that civilization tried to control but couldn't. Most medieval people never saw the ocean. They lived inland, far from the coast. For them, the sea was mythical, almost imaginary. They heard stories about it. They heard about sailors and merchants who braved the sea. They heard about ships that were lost at sea, that disappeared, that never returned. They heard about storms that came from nowhere and destroyed everything. They heard about sea monsters. They heard about magical islands that appeared and disappeared. The sea was a place of absolute danger, a place where normal rules didn't apply, a place where you might die horribly or encounter the impossible. For people who lived near the coast, the sea was slightly less abstract but no less terrifying. Fishing was dangerous. Men drowned constantly. A fishing boat could disappear in a sudden storm. A man could fall overboard and vanish. The sea was acknowledged as necessary for food and commerce, but it was also seen as fundamentally hostile. The sea didn't want humans in it. Humans who entered the sea were taking their lives into their hands. They were risking everything. Navigation was terrifying. Medieval ships didn't have compasses. They didn't have maps that were accurate. A ship would sail by landmarks, by watching the sun and stars, by feeling the wind and the waves. If the weather turned bad, if clouds covered the sun and stars, a ship could become completely lost. A captain might have no idea where he was. He might sail in circles trying to find land. He might sail away from land into open ocean. Ships disappeared regularly. They were lost at sea. The crew drowned or starved or died of thirst, surrounded by salt water they couldn't drink. Medieval sailors understood drowning as a particular kind of death. Drowning meant your soul was condemned. You died without last rites. You died violently. You died in chaos. You died in a space that belonged to nothing Christian. If you were transported to medieval times, the first thing you'd notice would be the sensory overload. Everything would be overwhelming. The smell would hit you immediately. The noise would be disorienting. The darkness would be terrifying. The cold would be shocking. You'd be completely overwhelmed. Then hunger would set in. You'd want food. You'd eat what was available. It would taste terrible. Your stomach would reject it. You'd be sick. You'd be vomiting. You'd be miserable. Then pain would set in. Your feet would hurt from walking. Your back would hurt from bending. Your hands would hurt from work. You'd be in constant pain. Then fear would set in. You'd be afraid of disease. You'd be afraid of violence. You'd be afraid of starvation. You'd be afraid constantly. Then hopelessness would set in. You'd realize that this was your life now. You were trapped. You couldn't escape. You'd be here forever. You'd be in this suffering forever. Hopelessness would crush you. Let's talk about the psychological profiles of medieval people. Medieval people were different from modern people in fundamental ways. They had different psychology. They had different ways of thinking. They had different ways of experiencing the world. They were shaped by their environment in ways that would be hard for modern people to understand. Medieval people were more resigned to suffering. They accepted pain and difficulty as normal parts of life. They didn't expect comfort. They didn't expect happiness. They expected suffering. This resignation allowed them to survive. They could endure because they didn't expect things to be different. Medieval people were also more spiritual. They lived in a world populated by spirits and demons and divine forces. They experienced the world as fundamentally mysterious and supernatural. They believed that prayer could change outcomes. They believed that God intervened in their lives. This spirituality gave their lives meaning even if the circumstances were terrible. Medieval people were also more communal. They thought of themselves as part of a community first, and as individuals second. Their identity was tied to their family and their village. They made decisions based on what was best for the community, not what was best for themselves. This communalism created stronger bonds, but also less individual freedom. Medieval people were also more fatalistic. They believed that their circumstances were predetermined. They believed that they couldn't change their fate. This fatalism allowed them to accept their circumstances. They didn't waste energy trying to change things. They accepted what came to them. But a modern person transported to medieval times would not have these psychological traits. A modern person would still think like a modern person. A modern person would still expect comfort. A modern person would still expect to be able to change their circumstances. A modern person would still think of themselves as an individual. These expectations would clash with medieval reality. This clash would destroy you. Let's talk about what would happen to your mind. After a few months of medieval life, your mind would start to break down. The sensory overload would continue. The hunger would continue. The pain would continue. The fear would continue. And there would be no relief, no medication, no therapy, no escape. You'd probably develop anxiety disorders. You'd have constant anxiety about survival. You'd be hypervigilant. You'd be always looking for threats. Your nervous system would be in constant fight or flight mode. This would be exhausting. You'd be burned out from constant anxiety. You'd probably develop depression. The hopelessness would crush you. The meaninglessness would crush you. The suffering would crush you. You'd stop trying. You'd stop caring. You'd become depressed. You'd be unable to function. You'd probably develop trauma responses. You'd be exposed to violence and death regularly. You'd develop PTSD. You'd have nightmares. You'd have flashbacks. You'd be triggered by sounds or smells that reminded you of traumatic events. You'd be broken by trauma. You'd probably develop dissociation. You'd stop being present in your own life. You'd disconnect from reality. You'd float through your days without really being there. Your mind would retreat from the unbearable reality, and you'd probably develop substance abuse issues. You'd drink alcohol to escape. You'd become dependent on alcohol. You'd be an alcoholic. Or you'd become addicted to pain medication if you could get it. You'd be using substances to cope with the unbearable reality. All of these mental health issues would be untreated. There would be no medication. There would be no therapy. There would be no support. You'd just be broken. You'd be psychologically destroyed. You'd be a shell of a person going through the motions of survival. Let's talk about what would make you want to live. If you were in medieval times, what would give you reasons to keep living? Your family would give you reasons. You'd love your children. You'd love your spouse. You want to protect them. You want to make sure they survived. This would give you reasons to keep going. Your faith would give you reasons. If you could believe in God and heaven, you'd have hope for the afterlife. You'd have belief that your suffering had meaning. You had belief that you'd be rewarded after death. This would give you reasons to keep going. Your community would give you reasons. You'd have connections to people. You'd have bonds with your family and your village. You'd have responsibilities to them. You want to fulfill those responsibilities. This would give you reasons to keep going. Survival instinct would give you reasons. Even if you didn't have conscious reasons to live, your body would want to survive. Your instinct would drive you to eat, to drink, to sleep, to survive. This instinct would keep you going even when you didn't want to. But these reasons might not be enough. If your family died, if your faith weakened, if your community rejected you, you might lose your reasons to live. You might want to die. You might try to kill yourself. And many medieval people probably did. Let's talk about what would change you. If you survived medieval times, if you adapted and survived for years or decades, you'd be fundamentally changed. You would not be the same person who arrived in medieval times. The suffering would transform you. The trauma would transform you. The poverty would transform you. You would probably become cynical. You would lose your idealism. You would stop believing that things could get better. You would become hardened. You would stop trusting people. You would become selfish because you'd have to put your own survival first. You would probably become violent. You would have been exposed to violence constantly. You would have been forced to be violent yourself. Maybe you would have internalized violence as a normal response to conflict. You would become a violent person. You would probably become sick. Your body would be broken. You would have chronic pain. You would have a chronic illness. You would be constantly sick. Your health would be destroyed by medieval conditions. You would probably become old. You would age rapidly from stress and suffering. You would look much older than your actual age. You would be prematurely aged by medieval conditions. And you would probably not want to leave. If you were somehow transported back to modern times after years in medieval times, you might not want to go. You'd be traumatized by the experience. You want to stay where you were. You want to be dead. You want all to be over. Modern life might be too much stimulation. Modern comfort might feel wrong. You'd be broken by your experience. Let's talk about the conclusion. You would not last a day in medieval times. The sensory overload would be overwhelming. The hunger would be unbearable. The pain would be intense. The fear would be paralyzing. You would not survive long. You would be dead, or wishing you were dead, within months probably. Medieval times were not a romantic fantasy. Medieval times were hell. They were brutal. They were short. They were full of suffering. And we should be grateful we don't live there. We should appreciate modern medicine. We should appreciate modern sanitation. We should appreciate modern food production. We should appreciate all the things that make life bearable. And we should use this understanding to make the modern world better. We should work to reduce suffering. We should work to improve conditions for people living in poverty. We should work to create a world where everyone has access to the things that make life bearable, because the alternative is medieval suffering. And nobody should have to experience that. So here we are at the end of this conversation. We've explored what medieval life would actually be like. We've gone through the suffering, the pain, the hunger, the fear, the disease, the hopelessness. We've understood that medieval times were genuinely terrible. Thanks. Please like and subscribe our channel.